The winter of 1805 settled heavily over Central Europe. Frost clung to the fields, and the breath of soldiers turned to mist under the pale moon. On a quiet night in December, thousands of men camped across the plains near a small Moravian town called Austerlitz. They were cold, hungry, and far from home. Yet their faith in one man kept them still. That man was Napoleon Bonaparte. It had been barely a year since he had crowned himself Emperor of the French. The young general, once marked as a Corsican outsider, now commanded the most formidable army in Europe. But across the continent, old monarchies were uniting against him. Austria, Russia, and Britain, powers that feared the rise of revolutionary France, had joined forces to crush him. By the winter of 1805, their armies were closing in. To the Allies, Napoleon's empire seemed fragile, overextended, and vulnerable. To Napoleon, this was the perfect moment to strike. The place he chose to make his stand was near the town of Austerlitz, today Slavkov in the Czech Republic. He had marched his army more than 600 miles in just a few weeks, moving with speed that stunned his enemies. Outnumbered, exhausted, and deep in hostile territory, he now faced a coalition that believed victory was certain. But what Napoleon possessed, more than numbers or supply, was a mind that saw the battlefield like a chessboard. And on the night before battle, that mind was alive with calculation. As darkness fell on December 1st, 1805, the French army bivouacked in silence. Campfires flickered across the frosty fields. Soldiers wrapped themselves in tattered coats, their breath steaming in the cold air. Many were veterans of Italy and Egypt, men who had followed Napoleon for years. They knew that tomorrow might decide the fate of France. Still, they trusted their emperor. That evening, Napoleon did something extraordinary. Instead of remaining in his tent, he walked alone among his troops. He moved from campfire to campfire, speaking to the men, asking about their families, their rations, their wounds. When they saw him, that familiar silhouette in the greatcoat and bicorn hat, they rose to their feet, shouting his name. Vive l'Empereur echoed across the dark plain. Napoleon raised his hand and smiled. Sleep well, my children, he told them. Tomorrow you will write history. That night, a thick fog rolled over the low hills around the village of Pratzen. To most, it was a curse. Visibility would be poor. But to Napoleon, the fog was a gift. He saw in it a cloak to hide his true intentions. For days, he had been pretending weakness, deliberately leaving his right flank exposed, as if inviting the Allied army to attack. He wanted them to believe he was retreating. And they believed it. The Austrians and Russians planned to crush his right wing at dawn, confident they would roll up the French line. What they didn't know was that Napoleon had hidden his best troops in the mist, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Inside his tent that night, Napoleon studied the maps one last time. His marshals, Soult, Lenz, Bernadotte, and Marat, gathered around him, their faces lit by the lantern's glow. He spoke calmly, his tone measured, almost cold. Tomorrow, gentlemen, we will finish this war in one blow. When the enemy attacks our right, we will strike through the center. Soult, your corps will take the Pratzen heights. That is the key. Once it is ours, the day will belong to France. He paused, his eyes fixed on the map. He knew that everything depended on timing. A single misstep could destroy him. But where others saw risk, Napoleon saw opportunity. He believed in his soldiers, in his plan, and above all, in himself. As the night deepened, the camp grew silent. Some soldiers wrote letters they would never send. Others stared into the fire whispering prayers. In the distance, the church bells of Austerlitz tolled softly through the mist. Napoleon stepped outside and looked across the sleeping camp. The fog glowed faintly in the moonlight, and he felt an almost supernatural calm. Later he would say he had never been so certain of victory. At dawn on December 2nd, the sun rose through the fog, a brilliant golden disk shining over the frozen plain. It would be remembered forever as the sun of Austerlitz. When Napoleon saw it, he turned to his men and said, "Soldiers, remember this day. You must finish the war with one thunderclap." The Allies advanced just as he had predicted. Their columns poured forward, attacking the French right, confident that the enemy was collapsing. But as they moved, they weakened their center, exactly as Napoleon had planned. At the perfect moment, he gave the order, "Now, Soult, go forward." The French troops surged up the Pratzen heights, bayonets glittering in the sunlight. Through the fog, they burst upon the Allied center, catching them completely off guard. What followed was chaos. Gunfire, shouting, drums, and the thunder of cannons. The sun broke fully through the mist, illuminating the battlefield in a surreal golden light. Napoleon rode to the front, his white horse rearing as he pointed toward the enemy lines. His voice cut through the noise. "One sharp blow, and the war is won." By midday, the battle was decided. The Allied center had collapsed. The Russian and Austrian forces were surrounded, their formations shattered. Thousands were taken prisoner, others fled in panic across frozen ponds that soon cracked under the weight of retreating men and horses. It was a slaughter, but a victory so complete that it would be studied for generations. When the guns fell silent, the field was littered with the wreckage of war. Snow mixed with blood. Smoke hung over the valley like a shroud. Napoleon rode among the wounded and the dead, silent and pale. Even in triumph, he understood the cost. But in the eyes of Europe, he was now invincible. The coalition had been destroyed. Austria sued for peace within weeks, and across France, the name Austerlitz became a symbol of genius. That night Napoleon returned to his quarters. Exhausted, he sat alone by the fire, dictating his report to the Minister of War. He spoke in short, precise sentences. No boasting, no arrogance, just cold efficiency. When he finished, he looked up and said quietly, "I have fulfilled my destiny today." Historians would later call Austerlitz his greatest masterpiece, a triumph of planning, deception, and timing. It was the perfect expression of his military philosophy: to see what others could not see, to move faster than anyone expected, and to turn weakness into strength. But for those who fought that day, what they remembered most was not the tactics, it was the man. The way he had walked among them the night before, calm and confident, as if he had already seen the outcome. The Battle of Austerlitz changed Europe forever. For nearly a decade afterwards, no power dared to challenge Napoleon directly. He became the ruler of a continent, reshaping borders and laws according to his vision. But like all empires, his would not last. Austerlitz was both the height of his glory and the beginning of his legend. From that day on, he began to believe that nothing was impossible, and that belief would one day lead him to overreach, to Russia, and eventually to his fall. Yet history remembers the brilliance of that December morning. The fog, the golden sun, the perfect timing, all of it became myth. Generals from every nation would study his maneuvers at Austerlitz, trying to understand how one man could outthink armies twice his size. But perhaps the secret was not in the maps or the plans. It was in the mind of Napoleon himself. Restless, confident, and utterly fearless. In his later years, exiled on a lonely island in the Atlantic, he often spoke of that battle. When visitors asked him which moment of his life he would relive if he could, he smiled and said, "The morning of Austerlitz. I felt that I commended not men, but destiny." And so, more than 2 centuries later, the story endures. The night before Austerlitz was not just the eve of a battle. It was the moment when a man's faith in his own genius changed the course of history. A single night of calm before the storm, when an emperor walked among his soldiers and saw with perfect clarity the sunrise of his greatest victory.